Thank you, Ingvild. Yes, how do we get from the one to the many? Mary Lawlor mentioned Václav Havel earlier. Václav Havel spoke about and wrote about the power of the powerless. Oleksandra uses the term, how do ordinary people get to do extraordinary things? So I'd like to explore with both Beatrice and Gina how exactly they have done it, and maybe we can have a bit of a crash course so that we can have more ordinary people doing extraordinary things, working in coalition, so that we can bring positive change to this world. Now, both of you probably share lots of things in common, but one of the things that you certainly have done in your advocacy is to tackle two seemingly impossible missions, both of them very closely related to doomsday scenarios, where very few individuals hold the button that decides the destiny of our common humanity. In your case, Beatrice, it's about nuclear weapons, where we have 9 nuclear states that have 13,000 warheads in their different silos. Yet you managed to come together with a number of partners, building the international campaign with about 650 participants, and you have actually been keeping the finger from those 9 states away from that red button. How did you manage to transform citizens into people who could actually push states to negotiate and ratify a binding treaty to ban nuclear weapons?
It's a tough question. Thank you so much for having me here. It's been an incredible day and such inspiring speakers. And throughout when we talked, I've been thinking a lot about it. And just the theme of this conference, Human Rights Heroes, I think is really important that we reflect on the fact that most human rights heroes are not seen as human rights heroes, right? They're, and especially, and I love the comments about Norway and sort of pointing that out because I'm Swedish and we have the same thing. We love to look at it at somewhere else, right? And that it goes on somewhere else, and we're very supportive here in the Nordic countries, for example, about that. But actually, human rights heroes are seen as, security threats or difficult or annoying and don't have a lot of social status. Very few human rights heroes get the privilege of receiving a Nobel Peace Prize and get that kind of status and celebration. So I think it's really important that we reflect on that. So, for example, nuclear disarmament has been seen as one of those really hopeless issues. It's naive, it's never going to happen, and who do you think you can do? Are you really going to be able to achieve something? So one of the things that, of course, we have to do is to create alliances and create communities when we can support each other, when we can work together. I think that's really the recipe of first protecting human rights defenders, making sure that they have communities around them, that we're not alone in this fight. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, feeling completely alone and abandoned when inevitably the powerful that you stand up against are going to come after you and criticize you. So you need a community. So you need to find your allies, find your people around you to really build groups where you can do things together. Everything is much more fun when you do it together. That's really something I think that we have to do. And also these issues, whether or not it's a human rights situation in a country, if it's massive global catastrophes like nuclear war, climate change that feels like it's getting warmer and warmer by the day, we have to also find joy in this kind of work, and that it's something that we can actually have fun and develop friendships and solidarities. One of the most remarkable things about ICANN is that I've met so many friends and so many great people that I've learned from, so many people in other movements that we learn from, and that it's a real sort of effort of solidarity. I think that's what really keeps us together and kind of keeping the motivation to work on these difficult issues.
Thanks, Beatrice. Gina, talking about these doomsday scenarios, 1.5 degrees, right? That's what we hope we can achieve. Now, you've been working on climate change. Once again, this knows no boundaries. Decisions taken in a few states, namely the petrostates, right? They decide how much they will drill, how much they will pump. allowing others to burn. So how have you built, your community of supporters, and how are you translating that into political change?
Tough question. I've been working against climate change for the past 10 years, so it's been almost half my life. And it's weird working with it in Norway, because we see ourselves, as we've been talking about, as this green, great country, but actually we are one of the countries fueling the climate crisis with our oil production. And then it also is quite hard to start those conversations in Norway, because that is such a big part of our identity as a country, the oil production and oil industry. And Norway is also on top of the countries where people doesn't believe in climate change. So that's a tough point to start. We're together with USA and Saudi Arabia or something. We have a huge issue, and we have problems communicating it and communicating the crisis in it. So, of course, I feel like we've tried everything for the past 10 years and many years before I started. And building alliances has been one of the most effective measures, because we need to bring people on board in this gigantic transition that we're going through. We're building another society, and people are worried what society will be, if there will be a place for them in that society. And that's also why people, for example, working with oil production is not such a big fan of the green transition often, which is understandable if you're worried that you won't have a work after the transition. So we've been working a lot with dialogue, trying to bring more people on board, building alliances, and also making that green transition more something else than a dream, but actually a concrete plan where people see themselves. And also, the alliance with indigenous people in Norway has been really important, because we tend to forget the minorities, and we cannot build the society of tomorrow violating basic human rights in Norway. So I think the alliances has been the most important part, and will be in the future as well.
We were talking sooner about at times the uneven burden that is put on human rights defenders to actually come up with the perfect plan in order for politicians to be able to act on them. Can you both talk about that uneven burden? Why is it that people who might not be scientists, might not be journalists, might not be military specialists, have to come up with a perfect plan, while politicians basically just continue to dibble and dabble?
It drives me crazy. It's absolutely. Anyone who wants to do something good has much of a higher burden of proof and gets held to a higher standard than the people who are just being very cynical and saying that, the world is awful and nothing good is going to happen, and so let's just sit back and enjoy it. I think it's fear that's speaking in that way. I get a sense right now that people are really scared about the future. Whether or not you are in a country where there's war going on, for example, you're legitimately scared of that, but also in countries like, my own country, Sweden, for example, even the people who deny that climate change is happening, they know it's happening, right? We know things are getting worse in many ways. And I think that sort of fear makes it very easy to sort of cave into the cynical feelings about it. And then people who are coming with proposals and saying we have to do something, it becomes a bit provocative because it's challenging them. And it's telling them that, no, we have to do something, and they don't want to hear it. So they kind of get aggressive and complain about the way we argue, or is this the right method or not? I don't know how many times people have said well, you shouldn't do this strategy, you should do that strategy instead. Would you listen more if we did it another way? And I think that with climate change, you shouldn't be doing these civil disobedient actions, for example, you should peacefully protest and in a way that doesn't bother anyone with power. Has that worked before? So it's really infuriating, and I think you have to develop a lot of thick skin in this field. And again, that's why the community matters. Every time I attend a lot of meeting with, all the NATO people and the generals and the military dudes telling me that I'm wrong about everything, it affects you, and you get really uncertain of your own arguments and feeling sort of worried about that. And then you go to the events where people are on your side, and you kind of remember, like, oh yeah, we're many, and actually, I'm not crazy. Like, this actually makes sense. They are the ones who are wrong. So I think it's really important that we don't let that drag us down, and then we also constantly focus on the politicians. Both in nuclear weapons and on climate change, I constantly see people asking, media want to report about how bad things are. They want to report about the problem, and very rarely about the solutions on the table. And that's one of the key things, right? We don't need to ask more activists about climate change. We need to ask the politicians, what is the plan? Same thing with nuclear weapons. We can have all the experts talking about how bad the situation is and how it's getting worse. But what is the Prime Minister of Norway? What's the plan for getting rid of nuclear weapons in this world? What is the plan to get rid of Russia's nuclear weapons, for example? How are we going to move forward with this and solve this big problem we have? And why, so we need to kind of pivot it back. It's not us, we are not the decision makers, actually. We're just trying to raise like awareness about it. We have to focus on the politicians, and they are the ones who have to answer so tougher questions to them.
I totally agree. And I had this really weird experience where I was on the phone with a journalist, and he was saying, like, well, your organization has existed for 50 years, and the world is right now kind of going to hell. So what are you doing wrong? Which is crazy to put that responsibility on an organization, mainly organizing people who are like 17 years old and still in high school. But that is actually kind of what it feels like, that it is our responsibility, and it's just so unfair. But still, we have taken that responsibility and are making a change. And the one thing I could say to that journalist is, you can be sure that if we were not here, the world would be a much worse place. So I know that we are having an effect, making change, and at least the politicians are not. And it is crazy that they can just stand by and watch this crisis happening without being confronted with it. And in Norway, we've had, of course, all over the world, a summer with extreme weather and catastrophes every week. And in Norway, we are lucky to not be that exposed to climate change right now, but we've had this extreme weather and floods and people losing their homes the past month. But media and politicians aren't talking about this as a consequence of climate crisis. We aren't talking about how we can reduce emissions, what we're going to do with our massive amount of oil. And that is so weird that that link doesn't exist even in 2023.
So, Gina, if I may, we are just a couple of months away from COP28, which will be hosted by a petrostate, United Arab Emirates, a country which doesn't have a fawning human rights situation. How do you continue to find hope that we are going to attain those climate change negotiations that will have a meaningful impact in light of the fact that the petrostates still continue to carry tremendous weight within the negotiation process, and that civil society at times has difficulty in being able to insert itself in these discussions? Not only is the UAE obviously not a human rights respecting state, but previous COP was in Egypt, where Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is no friend of civil society. So how do you keep hopeful, and what do you see as coming next?
I think every activist knows that hope is a choice, and it kind of it is a choice, but it's also like staying in this fight doesn't feel like a choice, because it's just a tremendous responsibility. We live in the most important years of all times, probably, to avoid catastrophe. And we didn't choose to be born at this point, but this is what you get to work with. And I think the most important thing for me is knowing that it is not winning or losing. in the climate battle. Because, of course, we really, really want to reach the 1.5 degree goal. But if we don't, then we're not allowed to give up. Because every ton of CO2 that we can prevent from leaking out in the atmosphere will help us save lives and species and land. And it will always be possible to make that positive change and to save someone's life. And that could be me, and it could be you and you. So nobody's allowed to give up. And I feel like in Norway, politicians and business leaders and there are so many people who feel like that they can choose to believe or not, to have hope or not. But we have this gigantic responsibility, and we can still save lives, and it will never be too late to fight climate change. So I think that's the most important thing for me, giving hope, and hopefully it will keep me going for the next 70 years.
I certainly hope so. Certainly hope so. Beatrice, over to you in terms of hope. Yes, we have this treaty. We've had, I believe, 60-some states that have ratified. Unfortunately, the 9 declared nuclear weapon states have not. By the way, some homework for Norway, nor has Norway. We have heard during the Ukraine war that at times Russia has hinted that they might use a tactical nuclear weapon, using this euphemism of tactical as if it were something small, minimal, when in fact any tactical nuclear weapon today is many times larger than the bombs dropped in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So how do you stay hopeful in terms of what is happening just, not too far?
Well, it depends on which day, right, and how you wake up, in which mood. I mean, I think it's very easy to get depressed and cynical in this field and feeling like there is no hope. But I always tend to think that that is what the people who want status quo wants me to feel like. They want us to give up hope and not feel like there's no point of it. Because I also see how much just a few individuals can achieve if they work together. And as an example for that, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was negotiated by around 120 governments. You have around 80, almost 95 that have signed the treaty, 68 I think have ratified so far, keeps growing steadily. And of course, the 9 nuclear armed states have not yet signed it. And we're working on that. But also, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact. These kind of instruments and the work that human rights heroes are doing, even if the governments keep saying no, it still impacts them. And I find it really, we must not lose hope of how norms and international law actually impact all governments, democracies or not. When the full-scale invasion, when Russia started a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I woke up that morning and just feeling like, this is so horrible, and it's evidence that they just don't care about all the rules and norms and stuff. But then do you see also how they're finding really hard to justify it, making up lies, trying to navigate, the US did this then, and trying, because they understand that you can't just do whatever you want. You have to kind of at least pretend like you're following some kind of rules. And it's depressing, right? And it's really awful to see it happening. But I think we should also take heart in that they are at least trying to have to fake it, right? And trying to pretend. We saw that with Syria, for example, with chemical weapons at the same time, that they're trying to have to kind of figure out how to blame some non-state actors, for example, for the use of chemical weapons. And that to me is evidence that the normative work works, and that it really has an impact. So the activists that pushed forward with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the use and the threat of use of nuclear weapons is prohibited under international law in this treaty. So when Russia then explicitly launches this full-scale invasion under the threat of nuclear weapons to intimidate us, to make us not dare to fully support Ukraine in this, that's illegal under international law. And what we could use then was to rally the countries that have signed the treaty And some of them are close allies to Russia and have not strongly condemned the invasion, but they could condemn threats to use nuclear weapons. So we work with them to really push them on that, to really get them to say that threatening to use nuclear weapons is unacceptable. And what we could see was this sort of wave of other countries, even China said that, and had India saying that. And that comes back, and Putin needs allies. He's desperately trying to figure out allies. So the work that some activists did, even though China hasn't signed the treaty, Russia hasn't signed the treaty, the US hasn't signed the treaty, still managed to influence them and makes it sort of, and I think that Putin was a little bit taken aback. What do you mean I can't do this? What do you mean I can't just threaten it? Why are people getting upset with me? And immediately backtracked and trying to pretend and gaslight us that they weren't threatening to use nuclear weapons. So I get hope from seeing how a few regular people like you in the audience actually shifted the perspective on that because of this work. And imagine what we can do if we many more.
Well, thank you both for your courage, your advice in fighting these doomsday scenarios, and